has expired. Senator Back.
Acting Deputy President, at some time in the second half of this year, the Australian people will have to make their minds up who they trust to manage our economy into the future. It is a critically important question at any time, but especially so as we have the black clouds hanging over the world economy. The next 5 to 6 years are going to be very difficult for this country, for this region and the world generally. And Acting Deputy President, this is the reason why the Turnbull government is consulting widely. It's taking advice from every sector. It is not rushing precipitously into decisions. And the contrast, of course, is clear, and that contrast is the alternative, which was the Labor government of the last 6 years. A government which was not able to carefully consider options, a government that was not able to stand back, consult widely from a broad cross-section of the community before they made their precipitous decisions and set about destroying what was a very, very sound economic circumstance in this country, and that was one of no net debt, no deficits and cash in the bank. And let me just reflect on a couple of those quickly. The Gillard Memorial Halls, which, as we know, was largely wasting about $13 billion of expenditure, a circumstance in Victoria where by the time the money actually came to be spent there wasn't a need to do it, but they couldn't claw it back, a circumstance which in New South Wales we know there was vast overcharging of poor quality properties, where schools had the situation of classroom blocks being knocked down to put temporary classroom blocks in place which were inferior, where we had to, through the exercise of the committee of which I was a member, organise Mr Brad Orgel and his group to do an in-depth evaluation in which he, of course, came up with the failure of what was a precipitously organised program. I then move, of course, to the mining tax, a tax which excluded Mr Martin Ferguson, probably the only person on that side who had any knowledge at all of the resources and energy sector. He was excluded in a series of negotiations with major miners. They were told by this side and by people in the community generally that the mining tax would earn no net income at all, and neither it did, Acting Deputy President. Companies paid millions of dollars to be able to prove they wouldn't be paying the tax, but worse than that, Mr Swan, the then world's best treasurer, made the estimate as to how much money he would make from this mining tax and spent it. And of course, as time went on, we knew very well that the mining tax would make no money, that it would cost more. Imagine a tax, even from a Labor government, that actually cost more than it brought in. And so then we had a circumstance where it had to be reversed. I could go on further, pink bats, I could talk about the vehicle leasing scheme, etc. And now I turn to the latest of the failed examples of poor planning by an incompetent group now in shadow ministry, and that is negative gearing. Understand this, Acting Deputy President. The property sector is the largest sector in the nation. It accounts for 11.5% of our national wealth. It creates more than 1.1 million jobs in this economy, more than mining and manufacturing combined. Understand that there are some 840,000 Australians with taxable incomes below $80,000 a year who negatively gear property. And that includes, let me read them out, 53,800 teachers, 52,000 retail workers, 35,900 nurses and midwives, and 22,600 hospitality workers. But understand this, because I'll get to why it is such a poor policy by Mr Shorten and his group. 91% of the Australian community who negatively gear have only 1 or 2 properties. So we're talking about 9%. Acting Deputy President, why is it such poor policy? Because what Labor proposed would be to allow negative gearing only on new property. But Acting Deputy President, what happens to that property? Whether it's purchased and built by a homeowner initially or by an investor, immediately it is sold, it ceases to be eligible for negative gearing. So therefore, this great idea of encouraging people to only negatively gear in new properties, by its very definition, has a very, very short time frame. So what, of course, we know inevitably will happen is that we will see a deterioration of prices in that sector, including all of residential construction. Now, it was put to me on the weekend, and I don't believe it, I don't think Labor is so cynical, but it was put to me that residential construction, one of the biggest employers in the construction sector, of course, is not unionised. Now, Acting Deputy President, I refuse to believe that would be Mr Shorten's motive, would be to try and bring down a sector simply because it isn't unionised. But we know, of course, the importance not only of the supply to construction, the real estate industry, the real estate sales industry, property management, strata management, property maintenance industries, property investment itself. So, Acting Deputy President, that is why the proposal by Mr Shorten and his group is a poor one. Yes, I negatively gear. And yes, Acting Deputy President, inevitably what happens is that over time, if you invest wisely, your properties end up positively geared, as I have 2 properties positively geared. So they are now net contributors to the Australian tax system. So it is not just the negative gearing, it is the capital gains tax over time that is important. A staff member who I have the pleasure of saying is here in Canberra with me at the moment is in my branch office in Esperance, and I asked her, what's your attitude and position? And with her permission, I'll tell you, she's a single young person on a moderate income, a teaching qualification, invested initially in a small rental property, invested, I think, with a young family member. To quote her, I considered negative gearing to be my risk insurance. I would probably not have invested in property as a means of wealth creation if I didn't have the safety net of negative gearing. The money earned, of course, has been saved. She has built equity and now has been in a position to put a deposit down on a home for herself in Esperance. As she said, I wouldn't have built an investment property, stressful, time-consuming and risky, but having a small, cheap, older home there, waiting was easy, created wealth, and she, in fact, is part of that numeric of teachers who have been involved in this process. So, Acting Deputy President, I say in conclusion, the people of Australia have got a simple choice in the second half of this year. Do they want a responsible Prime Minister who will consult widely, who will use the breadth of his own business expertise over time, that of his colleagues, to actually come up with tax policies that will work into the future, that will put us back into a position again of surplus so that we can meet the black clouds that are over this country? And that's who I say the Australian people need to select. Not the pattern of the past, the fact that we had a Labor government that followed on from the Keating government, which built up $95 billion of debt. Now we've got about $600 billion of debt. And I finished with the comment by Senator Scott Ludlam today about affordable housing. I join with him. It's a critically important issue we have to solve.
Thank you.